He was born into slavery, but yet he made up in his mind that he was not going to remain a slave. Frederick Douglass was one of the greatest orators of his time, abolitionist. And once he made up in his mind that he was walking off the plantation, that's exactly what he did. When the plantation owner decided he was going to whip him again for being a bad boy, Frederick Douglass, who stood about 6'4", maybe 6'6", decided once and for all that he had had enough. You need to read his book, Narrative of a Negro Slave, Frederick Douglass. It's all in there, like Prego, baby. It's all in there. I'm Tyrone Bowman. This is Tyrone Bowman Tonight. I'm continuing with part 2 of Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech. He gave it on the 5th of July because he did not celebrate the 4th of July. So I'm picking it up where I left off at. This is part 2. Quote, and by the way, this speech was found on AmericanLiterature.com. Quote, whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me, that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. But I fancy I hear some of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists failed to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less your cause? Would be much money likely to succeed? But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? Or what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? That point is conceded already. Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws by their government or for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of these same crimes will subject a white man to like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read and write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beast of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your street, when the fowls of the air, when the cattle on your hills, when the fish of the sea, when the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then I will argue with you that the slave is a man. For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. It is not astonishing that while we are plowing, planting, and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that we are engaged in all the enterprise common to other men. Digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding the sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation? As a matter beset with great difficulty involving a doubtful application of the principle of injustice, hard to understand. How should I look today in the presence of Americans dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom, speaking of it, relatively and positively, negatively and affirmatively? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding that there is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven who does not know that slavery is wrong for him. This will continue. Never surrender, never quit.